been waiting for. I've never heard Bryant Mason speak in person here. Is this your first time at an event like this, Bryant? Like this? All right, well, let's do it like this, man. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for hanging on here today. We got Bryant Mason until 7:30, and then we're going to have the farm to fork meal.
Alright guys, so once you guys know Bryant Mason, like I said earlier, he's one of my favorite guys to work with on the agronomy side because he understands organics and he understands how to get to those target numbers and kind of work with some of my picky, choosy kind of things. Like, I don't like to use everything, I'm just kind of anti-sulfates. I won't use them when I absolutely need to. He actually works with me on finding target and hitting those targets without having to rely on just sulfate. So no animal slaughterhouse byproducts, nothing like that. No bone meals. So if you tell them that you're dragon fiber medicine certified and then you can't use certain things, this is a guy who could actually help you keep those values and actually hit those target numbers. He understands organics, highly intelligent. He's been working in the cannabis industry for a long time. I personally been working with him for about 5 years now on the cannabis side, I would say. And over the years, I've learned more about actually how to read a soil test work with him than the 15 years I've been growing this plant. He does an online course where he actually teaches you guys how to actually look at a Logan Lab the report, the saturated paste and the standard test, and actually be able to look at your own soil test and read it yourself. If you guys haven't seen his online course, I highly recommend it. It is all the cheat codes, all the everything you think he wouldn't want to give you. This dude gives you like a 4-hour course or a couple-hour course. Okay, so maybe I can finish it. He gave the cheat codes way too soon, apparently, all right? But no, it's a great course. I highly recommend it, guys. I'm excited to see this speak too.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve. My name is Bryant Mason. I'm a certified crop advisor. I live in Colorado. And I guess to start, thanks Tyler and Steve for trailblazing this event. It's pretty impressive, and I'm really impressed with your leadership, actually, in this whole space. So I appreciate you having me out. I'm going to talk for about an hour. I'm really plenty of time for questions. And first, I'm going to give a few minutes of background on how I got here and what my journey has looked like. I think that'll give some context to the presentation. So it all started for me in 2008. I got obsessed with vegetable gardening, and I was setting up community gardens. I graduated from school and I actually started a business called the Urban Farm Company. We would install raised bed vegetable gardens for homeowners in people's backyards, and we'd teach people how to grow their own food. And our tagline was "Feed Your Inner Farmer." I ran this business for about 5 years, and we installed a little over 3,000 of these 4x8 raised bed gardens all over the Front Range of Colorado. And at that, so there was this question of what do you fill a raised bed with? I mean, what kind of soil mix do you fill it with? And so I ended up mixing with third parties over 3,000 cubic yards of soil to fill these beds with. And I really started learning about all of the ingredients that we're using now in cannabis production. So rice hulls, different aggregate, different compost, biochar, sand, coco coir, lava fines. I ended up with that mix, and this is just with the context of arid Colorado. I'm growing vegetables, but the process really sent me down this learning rabbit hole, and I got kind of obsessed with soil and like what makes an ideal soil. And so I really got distracted, honestly, in my business with soil. And at the time I was really interested in how the mineral content of soil affects the nutrient density of vegetables. I'm still interested in that. And that's kind of what got me started. So a big learning from that was soil. The second thing is we had thousands of gardens across Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins. And I went and I drove to hundreds of these different backyards, and everything was the same. The soil was the same. The general location was the same, what we were planting, the varieties, the time in which we plant, the irrigation system, everything was the same, but there would be wildly different results in these different gardens. So some of them would have hundreds of dollars of produce in a single 4x8. some of them were stunted and struggling. And it took me a while to figure out that the primary difference between the success and failure of these gardens was moisture. And it wasn't surface moisture, like I could dig my finger in, but it was really about how people were irrigating. And so that's the first lesson. I'm going to come back to this. So then I moved, and actually, let me back up. Because the Sustainable Village guys have presented, that's when I found blue mats. This was probably 10 years ago. And I got really into blue mats because I realized that moisture was sort of everything when it came to plant health. And I moved to Oregon. After Amendment 64 passed, I was growing in Colorado. I moved to Oregon, and I really doubled down on my study of soil and agriculture. So I worked at a rec farm in Oregon. I helped get 10 light depth greenhouses set up. Eric would have been horrified with what they looked like. And I also started consulting. I was working for another agronomy firm, so we were doing a lot of consulting with berries in the Willamette Valley. I was taking university courses. I was just going deeper and deeper into soil science. And I became a certified crop advisor through the American Association of Agronomy. And during those 3 years, I was really diving deep into textbooks. And so another lesson I just want to share is I believe that textbooks are the single best source of information. So people always ask me, like, where do you get your information? How do you learn? I listen to podcasts. I occasionally read scientific studies that interest me. But if you are interested in diving deeper into any topic, I just think textbooks are the way to go. They're written by a handful of authors that take a single subject, they consume all the scientific literature over the course of their career, and then they write a chapter about it. And you just get to consume pretty fact-based information that it's thick, it's sometimes hard to digest, but it's the foundation of knowledge. And so what I call pop agronomy textbooks, I like these. I started with these. I still read these. I think they're fine. The guy on the bottom is a mentor of mine. I owe a lot to, but there's also a lot of misinformation in these books. So I just want to say, if you guys really want to go deep, buy textbooks. They're awesome. They're the cheat codes. Okay, so at the same time, I was in Oregon. I was learning about soil. I got obsessed with perennial crops, and I still am. I have a second life in perennial crop production. I don't know what happened here. There we go. So to me, perennials are really special because they appreciate in value every year, and they just naturally encapsulate all of the principles of soil health, keeping your soil covered. You can increase biodiversity in your production system, living roots year-round. They're inherently no-till. They're soil armor. And I like to say you can farm standing up and in the shade. So in 2021, I planted an orchard in western Colorado. The picture on the left is the baby trees we put in, and then this is last year. You can see just explosive tree growth, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. So that's a little bit of background. And today I'm going to present a ton of information about how to use testing to optimize plant health and yield. But I'm going to do so sort of in a larger framework. And one thing I want to bring to this community is a few things that I've learned working in general ag. So I primarily work with cannabis, but I also work in vegetable production and tree fruit, cut flowers, and a few other random crop types. And I've done a lot of thinking about what makes a farmer profitable in the long term. Not only in my farming, I've got an orchard, but I'm thinking about that a lot with the people I'm working with. So all of these 5 things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to really highlight number 4, which is how to use testing and precision. But I also want to talk about this concept that I've been thinking a lot about around a mindset of regeneration, which I'm just going to talk about that at the end. Okay, so the first thing that I have learned is that profitable farmers that I've worked with are really managing moisture. And I actually think that we've kind of heard about this today quite a bit. And I generally think that attention is a limited resource. And so there's this quote quote I'm going to read, arguably the most important skill is controlling your attention. This goes merely beyond avoiding distractions. The deeper skill is finding the highest and best use for your time, given what is important to you. More than anything else, controlling your attention is about being able to figure out what you should be working on and identifying what truly moves the needle. And so I want to argue that moisture management is what truly moves the needle, first and foremost. So I focus on nutrient management, but I'm the first person to say that managing moisture should be at the top of the list. And there's this quote, the best fertilizer is the farmer's footprints. To me, that's just encapsulates the idea of attention. So when you're out in your operation, your attention is the most valuable thing for your plants. And for me, that's mostly around soil moisture. I mean, obviously, reading your plants is most important, but really understanding and getting familiar with moisture is right there. So I told you the story about the urban farm company and how those gardens differ for moisture. The picture of my trees in the last couple slides, people always say, oh, you had that explosive tree growth because you doctored up the soil and you put all the amendments in. And I did. I cover cropped for a couple years. I spread manure. I did all the things. But that tree growth was what I attribute to irrigation technique. It was totally about water. So I just want to throw that out there. That's kind of my dirty little secret. And I actually think that's why blue mats have become so popular in recent years, is because they really do a good job with that moisture management. Okay, so the reason for that is sort of threefold, in my opinion. The first is, this is a graph of, or not a graph, but a chart of how plants acquire nutrients, how roots acquire nutrients. And when I say roots, I mean roots plus, mycorrhizae, the entire sort of rhizosphere. So there's three different mechanisms. The first is called mass flow. It's represented by this green chart. And mass flow is when nutrients move to the root system through the movement of water. So nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, sulfur literally have to move in the soil solution through the water to hit the root zone. Mass flow, represented with this yellow line, is similar in the sense that nutrients move from from a high concentration to a low concentration in the soil solution, which is water. So when you cut off water, you're stopping mass flow and you're stopping diffusion. And so all those nutrients, the primary mechanism for almost all of those nutrients is either mass flow or diffusion. And that's why when you see drought stress in a plant, it often looks like a nitrogen deficiency. So that's one reason. The second reason is microbial abundance is highest in a moist soil. And I think that's fairly intuitive for most of us. And then the third thing I want to mention, particularly relevant to outdoor growers, is water is an amazing temperature buffer, especially with diurnal temperature swings from night to day. So, moisture. I mean, maybe obvious, but I think it's worth touching on. Now, in terms of best tools, Izzy covered this really well. I think of 2-3 tools. I'm not going to go into this too much because I think his presentation was perfect. There's volumetric sensors, there's tensiometers, and there's the feel. For outdoor growers, I want to argue that the feel test is actually the most important. To understand what optimal moisture feels like is so important. I like to use a soil sampling probe. I take a 1-foot core. I try to do this every single day, again, outdoor in the growing season, and really get a sense of feel. Now, I also have very expensive tech that's giving me secondary data, but I'm determining my optimal levels definitely on the volumetric probes, but even on the tensiometers as well, just based on what I think is the right feel. Now, in an engineered media, I think that Izzy's right in saying that it's a little harder to get the optimal feel, and the sensors might be a little more important. But it doesn't really matter. My point is, use this stuff. Just pay attention to moisture. 2 more lessons I want to say about moisture. One is measure at various depths if you're in beds and pots. So I like to punch a hole in the bottom of a fabric bed and make sure, again, this is above that perched water table. I should have put this a little higher. But I think moisture content at 2 depths is critical when you're measuring. So that's the first thing. Second thing is irrigation frequency drives vigor. And I've experienced this in so many contexts. Cut flower producers right now are super into this thing called pulse watering. There's people sometimes call it continuous irrigation. Again, those peach trees, that vigor, that's from irrigation frequency. So lowering intensity and duration and increasing frequency drives vigor. So a couple of moisture lessons. Okay, the second thing I've observed is the most profitable farmers, they invest in nutrition. So, and fertility, I'm gonna call it fertility. 6 years ago or so, I did a big project with a multi-thousand acre organic blueberry farm in the Willamette Valley. And it was a team of agronomists, and they brought me in and they kind of said, go figure out a couple of these challenges, and I threw tons of testing at it. And in the process, I asked the head agronomist what their fertility budget was, because at the time I sort of assumed that, in farming they're going to be frugal farmers. They're not going to be spending a lot. He told me that their fertility budget was $1,500 an acre, which compared to conventional corn is like $150 an acre. It's like enough to buy their nitrogen, their synthetic nitrogen, pretty much. If you have a high-value organic crop, what I've seen, not just on that blueberry farm, but also in a few other crops, is the fertility budget is actually pretty high. They were applying compost, they were applying a ton per acre per year of gypsum, high-quality liquid fish. They were essentially investing a lot in the fertility of their soil, which was kind of surprising to me, but I've seen that same thing kind of over and over again. So, I think that's just important to know, is that we have a high-value crop here, and we should be investing in fertility. However, lesson number 3 is that the most profitable farmers also minimize the number of inputs that they're using. And so this may sound paradoxical, because how can you be spending a lot on fertility and also minimizing the number of inputs? And if you've ever been to a big trade show, I used to go to these trade shows, and there's these charismatic salespeople with their glossy images of amazing tomato fruit set or big fat dank flowers, and there's a lot of new tech and there's a lot of flashy stuff, and it's easy to get pulled in and to go down all these rabbit holes. But you have to be careful about how many things you use, in my opinion. There's a hidden cost to the number of inputs you're using in your operation. That hidden cost comes in the form of shipping and just the cognitive load of paying attention to so many different things and keeping track of different things. And in cannabis production, I think there's a tendency to throw the kitchen sink at it. And my belief and my observation from looking at other high-value crops is, as prices contract, it really makes more sense to try to minimize the number of inputs. So how to reconcile investing heavily in fertility but also minimizing the number of inputs well, first off, you have to hold that paradox in your head. Both of those things can be true. And the mechanism, probably the best mechanism that growers use, is split testing. So the best way to do this is to, split testing, let me just back up and explain that. Split testing is essentially where it's the best way to get a quick answer, because it's taking into consideration the context of your farm. So what works in a controlled trial in Ohio is not necessarily going to work on your farm. So, and it's inexpensive. Besides the time and energy and attention that you put into it, it's a free experiment. And so you take a part of your operation that's identical, same strains, same irrigation, same soil, etc., and you break it in half. And you do a control on one half and you do a treatment on the other half. There's essentially 2 ways to think about this. One is you test whether or not a certain action is going to make any sense or make any difference in your operation. However you define that: yield, crop quality, flavor, just visual observation. And so, for example, the control can be you just business as usual, and the treatment can be you apply gypsum and you observe for a round to see if there's a difference. Once you're committed to a certain action. The second way to split test is to do the control being gypsum number 1 and the treatment being gypsum number 2. So Diamond Cave gypsum versus Cal 58 gypsum, which I would love to see that split test, by the way. Okay, so that's how I've observed really good growers at scale in general agriculture get to answers for their operation and how they minimize the number of inputs. So what they're doing is they're trying to minimize the number of things, but then when they find something that works, they double down and triple down on it, and they invest in fertility and they invest in the things that work. And I think that's what leads to profitability, and that's what we should all be thinking about long term in this industry, because the kitchen sink is great, but at the same time, if we can minimize inputs, it increases our profitability, and honestly, we just have a better understanding of what's working and not working. So I to kind of finish this thought, this lesson, there's a quote that I really like, and this sort of applies to life. I like to think of myself as a minimalist, which I'm not. I'm kind of a failed minimalist. But this quote kind of explains that if you're in doubt about something that's in your life already, get rid of it. Not just things, this goes for identities, habits, goals, relationships, technology, and anything else. Default to not having it, then see how you do without. Err on the side of no, get rid of it. Start with a clean slate. If it was a mistake, you'll get it back with a renewed enthusiasm. So I like this quote because it's like we should apply this to our inputs too. Real quick, to go back to that blueberry farm, they had decent soil phosphorus, but the plant uptake of phosphorus, shown on both a tissue test and multiple sap tests, was low. And so I said, well, there's phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. And they said, okay, what product? And I said, well, there's this product, Mammoth P. It's popular in the cannabis industry. And they said, okay, we'll try it. And they split test Mammoth P on 5 acres. Was the control, and 5 acres was the treatment of Mammoth P to determine if they were going to, and if Mammoth P, it ended up not being a statistically significant effect at the rates they were using. But if it had been, they would have literally tripled down on that, and they would have applied it across their whole farm. So that's just kind of a summary. Okay, so number 4 is, I believe the most profitable farmers measure what matters, and they do so with testing and precision. So this is kind of the bread and butter of what I like to do and what I like to help growers do. And the key here is to be profitable, you have to be able to replicate results not 1 time, but 10 times or 20 times. And in order to do so, you have to understand what's leading to those results. And so you have to measure things and understand what's actually working and what's not working. And what this allows you to do is maximize your rate of learning as a grower. So you can really tease out what works and what doesn't work. I'll also add that we all have cognitive biases. You know, we all sort of subscribe to certain schools of thought, and testing can help you follow the data instead of following your biases. And so there's a few principles of testing that I want to cover. People often ask me, you know, when should I test? How often should I test? And I'm gonna cover a suggested protocol of testing for cannabis that I recommend. But the most basic answer is you test when you want to know something. So if in your system you amend your soil heavily and you just kind of let it rip, and then maybe you top dress once going into flower, then test twice. You know, before you plant, before you amend, and then when you top dress. If you're the type of person who's trying to customize liquid feeds and really, you know, customize your inputs on a weekly basis, then I would say test weekly. So that's kind of what I mean. The second principle is start simple. So all strains are different, we know that, but I work with a lot of people who will test 10 different strains, and often the underlying pattern is the same. So if you're starting testing, you can combine strains. With soil, it's even more striking. I showed a picture of me in a hazelnut orchard. I walked around that hazelnut orchard all day, The guy broke his farm into 10 different zones. I literally took hundreds of subsamples, combined them into 10 soil samples, and the results were practically identical. That same story has played out so many different times. And even in cannabis production, you test 4 beds, and even though the results on the soil test will look a little bit different, usually the underlying management decision is going to be the same. So I say the goal should be to combine tests and do as few as possible, and then increase the frequency at which you test through the cycle. Testing is only as good as the interpretation, unfortunately. There's something called the tragedy of the labs. This is what I call it. In the sense that you can send a soil sample to 10 different labs, and the 10 different results you get are completely different, which is because testing protocols are different, the lab techniques are different. Scott touched on this earlier. There's different there's different extractants. There's malate-3, saturated paste, Morgan, modified Morgan. There's all these different ways to test soil. So unfortunately, you have to stick with one lab, and even more so, you have to get intimately familiar with how that lab tests and what that data is telling you. So I, for a number of reasons, sort of committed to Logan Labs many years ago, and I'm just very comfortable with that data. So some of you have sent me, A&L reports or just other labs, and I can tell you what sort of the standard agronomic answer would be to other tests, but at the end of the day, you really have to commit to a lab and get to know their protocols and their data. The testing budget should be proportional to the economic value of the crop. That sort of goes without saying. And the final thing is, don't forget the one-time tests that will help you get to know the context of your operation more. So let me dive into those really quickly, because I think this is super important. These are the 4 what I call one-time tests that you can get. So compost, irrigation water, feed solutions and teas, and then if you're outside, soil texture. Okay, so this is, I'm gonna show you 2 compost tests. The one on the left is a worm casting. I guess it's not compost, it's castings, but I put that in the same category as compost. It's used as a similar input. And then horse manure. I just got this giant load of horse manure delivered to my farm in January, and I tested it. The first thing I always look at on a compost test is the carbon and nitrogen ratio. Anything around 18:1, you can assume that the mineralization of nutrients is going to be very, very slow. You probably won't get any nitrogen from that compost, at least in year 1, because the microbes are having to sort of balance their diet of carbon and nitrogen to break that material down. Anything above 20:1 will actually immobilize nitrogen in your soil. So you really have to be careful with that carbon and nitrogen ratio. You can get into a lot of trouble actually applying a really high carbon and nitrogen ratio compost. I then look at the nutrient levels, and I guess what I'm trying to point out on this test is the sodium. I look at the compost on a wet basis, because that's how you're buying it, it's how you're using it. You're not dehydrating it before you apply it. The sodium is 0.28%, which is quite high. So now I have this giant pile of manure, and instead of applying it to my high tunnel, I'm just going to spread it on my pasture. So the point is, I would never know that unless I tested it. And a compost test, I was just talking to Tad, is an incomplete way to assess compost, but it's an incredibly valuable piece of the puzzle. So I like to look at compost, I like to smell it, I like to feel it. Your eyes can tell you a lot about compost, but actual chemical analysis is super important. So every single source of compost in my valley I've tested, and it's very helpful. Okay, the second one-time test is irrigation water. So people always say, the water can change from season to season. That's obviously true, but I can't think of a single time. I've looked at hundreds of water tests, and I can't think of a single time it's changed that much. So just consider this a one-time test. So I'm going to show you 4 waters as quickly as I can. So the water on the left, for those who can't see, has a pH of 8.6. Water on the right has a pH of 7.3. You'd think the 7.3 would be better than the 8.6. But if you look at actually what makes up the mineralization of this water, everything is super low. It looks like RO water to me. There's a few ppm of everything in there. The total alkalinity, which is the water's resistance to pH change, that's the definition, is only 6 parts per million. This water over here has 325 parts per million of alkalinity. So what this is saying, this water test is saying, is water number 1 is going to hit the soil, and the soil is going to immediately buffer that pH to the pH of the soil. The water here, over time, over multiple irrigation cycles, over multiple seasons, this is going to start to affect the soil pH, and it'll absolutely affect the soil solution pH, which is what the plant roots actually see. So again, you can't just dip a pH meter in your water and get the whole picture. It's really important to understand what actual minerals are in your water and how much alkalinity there is on your water test. So I guess the summary here is water number 2 is a candidate for acidification. You don't have to acidify that, by the way, but I would never ever acidify this water, even though the pH is 8.6. Again, you have to get a water test to know that. Okay, 2 more waters. The water on the left, everything looks fine, low alkalinity, but sodium is 52 parts per million. So over multiple irrigation cycles, you're going to see sodium skyrocket in the soil, especially if you're efficient with your irrigation and you're not watering to runoff, if you're not leaching that soil naturally. This is a fun one. So I put this up here because there's an opinion that you don't have to worry about water pH, and you don't, well, I don't know if, and you don't have to RO, you don't have to filter your water if you're in living soil. This water has 800 ppm of sulfate, 375 ppm of chloride, 117 ppm of magnesium, which I think is 3 times higher than a hydroponic solution. So some water, especially out of wells, if you're pulling well water, you have to be extremely careful because you can get very dirty water. So this water, unfortunately, would have to be RO filtered. And in fact, you'd probably have to change your filters a lot because there's just so much in that water. Okay, so I think some growers don't realize that the water is your biggest input. So over time, water can easily be contributing more nutrient ions than all of your amendments and fertilizers combined. And they can create more headaches and problems. This is a high sodium water, what I call sodium blocking. So sodium is a cation and antagonizes the uptake of other cations. So essentially this sodium is creating all kinds of cation imbalances and deficiencies. Okay, feed solutions. One of the most underutilized tests is, I recommend all the time that growers send their feed solutions, their teas, their ferments, their bottled nutrients to get tested. So you can send it to Logan Labs and you can have them run these as a paste test with available nitrogen, what I'd suggest. And it's really helpful to know what you're actually feeding. So this is a test. It's a cannabis JLF, Jadam liquid fertilizer. Whole cannabis plants, well, minus the flowers, fermented down, and I had this grower run it as a paste test. And I guess we don't really need to go through it other than I want to point out one thing. So I've seen dozens of ferments now tested, and the one thing that is consistent is that there's really high soluble phosphorus in these ferments, which I think is, and this is the concentrate, by the way. This isn't diluted, so the grower can dilute this down as much as he wants. And it's really cool that the soluble phosphorus is so high because in organic production, there's really not a lot of organic options for soluble phosphorus. So I've never been super into ferments. It's just not my style of growing. On my operation, I never have time, and I usually don't work with growers on it. I'm super supportive. I think it's super cool. DIY fertilizers are awesome. But it wasn't until like this year that I started testing them, and I found it really interesting. So anyway, you can test anything. One more story real quick. This is a little bit strange, but it drives home the point. Someone got in touch with me a couple years ago. It was like a green crematorium. So instead of getting buried in a box or a or cremated. They had a process to liquefy bodies, and they bought 40 acres and planted all these deciduous trees and wanted to essentially spread the people's loved ones across these, this acreage. And I thought, that's pretty cool. And they said, okay, well, is it a good fertilizer? And I was like, and what should be the application rate? And I was like, okay, we got to test it. So we sent it into Logan Labs and ran it as a pace test. So a little sacrilegious, but and the second half of that story is we got the results back, and the pH was like 11.5, which I think is like caustic, and the potassium was 2,500 parts per million. And I thought, what the hell? And it's because their process for their green cremation was to essentially use potassium hydroxide to liquefy the bodies. And so we got the paste test back, and I was like, this is not a good fertilizer, and the dilution rate needs to be extremely high, and we wouldn't have known without testing. Bit of a weird story, sorry. Okay, so fourth one-time test is a topsoil test. For anyone who grows outside, this is irrelevant to peat-based engineered medias because there's no sand, silt, and clay. But if you're growing in topsoil, it's funny, you can ask any grower, what's your soil texture? And 80% of them either say, I've got a clay-heavy soil, or I have a loam. And no one ever says, I have a silty clay loam, And the only way to know that is to actually know the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. My experience with the jar test that you see online is it totally doesn't work. You can send in your soil, it's a one-time test, and you can get to the 0.1% what your sand, silt, and clay is. I think that's amazing context to understand the land that you own and the land that you're growing on. And once you know that, you'll start to realize that there are certain properties of different textures that are really important. Like a silty soil has high available water capacity, but it crusts over on the surface. And so you can start to really get more familiar and intimate with your soil, which I think is the name of the game if you're really a tuned-in cultivator. Okay, so those are the one-time tests. I'm going to talk about ongoing tests. And this is really the bread and butter of what I help growers do. I'm going to present just an example of a basic testing protocol and a more advanced testing protocol. Not that one of these is right. I mean, you really need to customize testing for your operation, but I just want to give a sense just for people who are interested in this. Okay, so the basic testing protocol for cannabis production, in my opinion, is you test at harvest or around harvest. You can actually test several weeks before harvest. I have found that the nutrition in the last couple weeks doesn't change that much. You get pretty accurate results if you test a couple weeks. If you're flipping rounds super, super quickly, test 2 weeks before harvest. Gives enough time to sample to get to the lab, get the data, for me to write a recommendation. But essentially, my point is, take one soil test to determine your pre-plant soil amendments. And then I would suggest taking another soil test with a tissue test right around week 2 of flower. Week 2 or maybe a couple weeks before that. The reason I say week 2 of flower is because with tissue testing, the research established target numbers they're all determined at week 2 of flower. I have found that if you test before that, through veg, week 1, week 2, even actually week 3, the data is very accurate. Once you get beyond week 3 or week 4, the plant starts to locate nutrients very, very quickly, and the data gets extremely wonky. Calcium skyrockets, magnesium skyrockets, nitrogen goes down, potassium goes down, and the data is very difficult to interpret. So I've had multiple growers send me samples at week 8 or week 9, and I'm like, oh, I can't really interpret this. So that's the basic protocol. A more advanced testing protocol is the same 2 times. You determine your pre-plant amendments, you week 2 of flower, You do soil and tissue. The other reason week 2 is important is it allows you enough time to actually influence your flower cycle. So if you see things, you have plenty of time to address them. That's the same. But I think there's a huge opportunity to do another tissue test way earlier in veg. So if you're vegging in 1 gallon pots, maybe in a different room, for some reason I never see tests on the plants that are a foot tall or 2 feet tall in their 1 gallon pot. It's always the flower beds, which sort of makes sense, but I would highly recommend testing when your plants are young too, because there's some nutrients you really want to make sure they're optimized from right out of the gate. So another tissue test earlier in veg. This little line is like transition, flip. And then I would say another tissue test if you're open to it around week 3 or 4. I know I said that that's not optimal, but it's nice to see a tissue test early in veg, week 2 a flower, week 4 a flower, and you can really see how the nutrients are moving. And then I'd add that the advanced protocol would also be to layer in sap testing. Specifically, I really like sap testing for nitrogen to really assess nitrogen utilization, because sap testing looks at nitrate and ammonium and molybdenum, none of which is looked at on a tissue test. And so you can really start to optimize nitrogen utilization with sap testing, which I think is a cool opportunity. The reason I say soil and tissue first is because I think that's the low-hanging fruit, the highest ROI tests. Scott did a great job addressing some of the limitations. Foliar residual is a problem with tissue testing. I see this a lot, and it's challenging. B, the data isn't as accurate after, let's just say, week 4 of flower. And C, sap does give sort of a different view into plant health, specifically with nitrogen utilization. So different approaches, you customize your own. The point is use testing, use data, and follow the data. I'll also add that what you see, so to me this is kind of the trifecta of testing. What you see, plant testing and soil testing. What you see obviously is very, very important, and you should be super tuned in with your eye. I put more emphasis on tissue testing results because I like to say the plant doesn't lie. So there's all kinds of things, you can have a perfectly balanced soil, but there's all kinds of issues that can lead to poor nutrient uptake or, there's just a million things that influence nutrient uptake, from VPD and temperature and light intensity and just so many things, microbial activity, and like I said, most importantly, soil moisture. So tissue testing is very, very important, and then soil testing. So that's kind of the order in which I'd suggest thinking about things. Okay, so I established target soil levels for cannabis production. And I guess this process started like 8 years ago. The first thing I did is I looked at topsoil targets for heavy feeding annual crops. I backed into the calculation for peat-based media using the classic agronomic conversions, and I found that it led to, it was just wrong, especially when you think about bulk density. You way under apply, and I think a lot of people have gone through this, the ideal soil and the intelligent gardener and all these things. And so I started from square one, and I hypothesized new targets by finding the highest yielding greenhouse tomato crops, pepper crops, and a few cannabis crops that I was like, those plants are healthy, the flowers are huge, what are the nutrient levels? And I sort of combined those to these and made these hypothetical target levels. And then I did about a year of calibration testing where I would mix these peat-based medias, and I would do one at a time, and I would add, let's just say, 5 cups of fishbone meal, and I'd let it mineralize, and I'd send it to the lab, and I'd see how many ppms of calcium and phosphorus and nitrogen fishbone meal would contribute to the soil. And I did this with pretty much every organic amendment, some of them multiple times. And then for the last several years, I've been refining those target levels, and I'm at the point where now my changes are like stupidly small. So I feel really good about these targets. And I presented them, Steve mentioned I put together this course a couple years ago, and I present all the target levels in the course, and a lot more. The problem, so I want to talk about these target levels. The problem is I don't have enough time to present them all, and there's a lot of context that go in each of them. So it's hard to just give you the numbers because you sort of have to understand how these tests work. They're also specific, like I said, to Logan Labs. So how I look at a soil test is I take a standard soil test from Logan Labs. It's a Malic 3 strong acid extraction with a pH of 2.5. You extract all the theoretically available nutrients out of your soil, which is essentially like the bank account of nutrients that are, over the long term, theoretically available. They take the same soil, they combine it with ideally your irrigation water, and they do a paste test, which looks at what's immediately available or soluble in this modeled soil solution. The reality we know as living soil growers is actually somewhere in between those two tests. But I believe you need both of those tests to sort of calibrate to what the reality of what the plant is seeing. And I have found that the paste test for most of the nutrients is much, much more correlated with the tissue results and what I'm seeing visually. So this is kind of what I teach. And there's honestly, actually, I was looking at this test earlier. This is an awesome soil test. So if this presentation will be up later, you could just take these as targets. And I mean, there's a couple things for improvement, but this is kind of the method that I use. And certain nutrients, I only look at on the standard test. I mean, first off, inorganic nitrogen is only on the standard test. Phosphorus I look at on the standard test, zinc and copper. A few others I look at both, and some of them I just look at the paste test. Because I found by looking at just literally thousands and thousands of tests that that's most correlated with what I'm actually seeing in tissue results. Now I want to make a point that this is just for peat-based engineered medias. The standard soil test was developed for topsoil, sand, silt, and clay-based soils, where there's a clay colloid that absorbs cations in an available but insoluble form. The plant can still access. There's only a few cations that are floating around in the soil solution. Peat-based medias are a little bit different in the sense that there's a lot more in the soil solution. It's not hydroponic, but it's closer to that end of the spectrum in terms of solubility, and there's no clay colloid to absorb those nutrients. So how I analyze a topsoil is actually quite a bit different than how I analyze peat-based media. But I'm not going to go into that because it's just too much. So to go back to these soil tests and these targets, I think that I'll leave time during Q&A. If we want to talk about targets, I will totally talk about targets. I'm kind of an open book. And I'll explain why, actually, I'm an open book at the end of the presentation. But the one that I want to talk about is nitrogen. Nitrogen is a very interesting nutrient to talk about because there's multiple plant-available forms. So actually, right up front, before I talk about nitrogen, my target that I sort of set is 125 ppm of soil test nitrogen, which is ammonium plus nitrate. 150 ppm if you're in veg for more than like 2 weeks. But if you open a bag of, let's say, Kiss Organic Soil or Build a Soil 3.0, these are the two soils that I've worked with the most. They're going to vary batch to batch, and new soils in bags are not totally homogeneous, so the results will vary, but 125 is kind of what I generally see. And those soils perform really well. But here's how nitrogen actually works. So there's 3 plant-available forms of nitrogen. There's small organic compounds, peptides, amino acids. Plants even have the ability to eat microbes. And this is kind of our ace in the hole as organic growers, in my opinion. There's a lot of benefits to plants uptaking small organic compounds. There's ammonium and there's nitrate, which is what the soil test actually tests. And by the way, I don't believe plants are uptaking huge quantities of small organic compounds. I think there's large benefits even when they uptake them in very small quantities, but I gotta say, I don't think that plants are uptaking like all their nitrogen in organic forms. And the reason for that, let me explain, is, okay, one more tip before I explain. There's also large organic compounds in the soil. Those are not plant available. That's compost, wood chips, alfalfa meal, cover crop residue. So those are the four types of nitrogen in the soil. These 3 are plant available. The arrows indicate that microbes are mineralizing that nitrogen and sending it, they're essentially enzymatically digesting it from large organic compounds to small organic compounds. It's then a specific family of microbes converts it to ammonium and then to nitrate. In the soils we're working in, this is kind of a one-way street. And so all of the nitrogen eventually ends up as nitrate. If you oversaturate your soil, you can send it in the reverse direction. But in engineered medias, it's really going in one direction primarily. And so the microbes feed very quickly. A mentor of mine says the microbes feed first. And so the reality of this is those middle 2 buckets, the small organic compounds and the ammonium, those reservoirs, those pools of nitrogen are very, very small. And so on a soil test, that's why you see 125 ppm of nitrate and 1 ppm of ammonium, is because the microbes are taking all of that, all those small organic compounds and the ammonium, and they're moving it into the nitrate bucket. So unfortunately, there's not a good way to test the amount of small organic compounds. There is a test called ACE protein that's effective, water-soluble nitrogen. There's lab tests that can do it, but economically speaking, it doesn't really make sense. And so I really do put a lot of emphasis on this nitrate reservoir, because if you see 125 ppm of nitrate, you know that there's enough nitrogen flowing through that nitrogen cycle and ending up in that reservoir. So what we do as organic growers is we're feeding large organic compounds and we're feeding small organic compounds, meaning soluble amino acids, liquid fish hydrolysate, and large organic compounds into those first 2 buckets, and they are moving through the nitrogen cycle to nitrate. So the reason I'm saying all this is because that nitrate target, or the total nitrogen target of 125 to 150 parts per million, isn't set in stone at all. It totally depends on how much you're feeding those first 2 buckets. It also depends on if you're in a 7-gallon pot, or if you're in a 30-gallon pot, or if you're in a bed. So the soil volume per plant totally matters. How long the plants are in that soil, and also the amount of fresh compost applied. Because when you apply compost, or really any amendments, but specifically compost, if you apply a bunch of compost and then you test 2 weeks later, you'll see some of that get thrown through that nitrogen cycle, and you'll see it as nitrate, but there's still a lot in reserve that's going to be releasing. So some growers I work with like to run their nitrogen low because they're feeding amino acids or liquid fish, or a combination of both, like all the time. My style tends to be a little bit more, you amend heavily up front, and you top dress occasionally through the season or through the cycle. So it just depends on your style of growing. The reason I'm saying all this is the nitrogen target, don't just immediately go hit 125 or 150. You really have to kind of understand the context of how these nutrients work. So if you guys want to talk about other nutrients and kind of what I think is the optimal target for cannabis, we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'll just leave time for that. And we can go through calcium, we can go through potassium, whatever. There's just interesting dynamics to all of them. Okay, so here are my tissue targets. These are a little bit easier to present because they sort of are set in stone. There's like 4 studies that have looked at hemp and cannabis for tissue, and I sort of took those and then I've adjusted them very slightly. I like higher calcium, I like a little higher nitrogen, to be honest, especially at that early in flower, because as you guys know, those plants can fade pretty quickly depending on the soil volume. So I think it's good to sort of have nitrogen in luxury levels. But otherwise, these are just from the studies that have been established. The only thing I'll add that I don't have time to talk about is ratios matter. But there's a lot of, the ratios that are thrown out, really the only like agronomically established ratios that I've seen, again, in textbooks with a lot of evidence and a lot of information is like nitrogen to sulfur, calcium to potassium. I mean, cannabis growers like nitrogen to potassium. So you kind of got to be careful with ratios because there's just a lot of misinformation about it. Okay, and Scott covered this pretty well with the tissue testing in terms of there are mobile and immobile nutrients, and that's why after week 2, tissue data gets a lot less reliable. Okay, so the question is, what do you do then with the test results mid-cycle? Like, how do you manage your operation once you have the test results? How do you amend the soil before? Okay, great. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. But then, like, what are the different ways to use the data mid-round? And the short answer is you get to customize. You get to do it however you want. So, like I said, my style has always been, I've always grown outside, and I like dry top dresses. So I get data, I test occasionally, I get the data, and I use dry top dress amendments. So nitrogen amendments, alfalfa meal, soybean meal, blood meal, insect frass, you can go down the list. There's a bunch of cool options. Bone meals, gypsum, potassium sulfate. A big tip is to try to mix these amendments in just a small amount of compost or mulch. 1, they distribute a lot better, but 2, I think that moisture helps them mineralize a lot faster. So the microbes really, if you guys are top dress heavy, you can get that crust. Some of the amendments that aren't as soluble as potassium sulfate and gypsum can just crust up. Maybe it's just an annoyance factor, but I think they're also releasing a lot faster to the plant when you put them in a little bit of compost because of that moisture and obviously the microbes. Okay, the other way you can grow is, I call this liquid fuels, which is like teas, extracts, ferments, different biological consortiums, molasses, humic acid. I named it like a bottled nutrient to try to mirror the idea that you can customize your bottled nutrients based on the data. You don't need bottled nutrients, you can just create them yourself. So liquid fuels, to me, all these things I just mentioned, are essentially increasing the rate of nutrient cycling. This is anecdotal, I have no good evidence for this, but I really like these in flour, like just the last 4 weeks of flour. I think sugars are great. Personally, in my peach orchard, I like a combination of a really high-fat liquid fish hydrolysate, humic acid, and molasses. I do that in the fall and the spring. So you can customize. The data doesn't necessarily help you customize as much with these sort of more microbial biostimulant products. The third way, which I would say that this is sort of the most precision way to grow using data, is to actually use liquid products, or you can use carbon-based sort of liquid organic products based on the data. And you can go nutrient by nutrient. So you can use soluble amino acids if your nitrogen is low. You can use a high phosphorus liquid fish, or that JLF I showed if your phos is low on either tissue sap or soil. Solution grade gypsum, potassium sulfate, micronutrient sulfates. I put rates here in grams per gallon and milliliters per gallon. But the ranges are insanely big. And that's because it totally depends if you're just trying to give a small shot, kind of a maintenance feed, or some people would do a continuous irrigation, like feed every single time, which seems a little crazy to me. Or these rates were established by a grower I worked with who was in 7-gallon pots and was feeding that rate, I think twice a week or something. So again, it depends on soil volume, how hungry your plants are, how big your plants are, etc. Okay, so I thought about what are the patterns I've seen from thousands of tests, and I thought that would be a large body of this presentation, but I started looking at the data from Logan for the last 4 years. I think I have I looked at 8,000 soil tests, and every year I've had a statistics friend of mine run different cool regression analysis on all the data, and it's hard to really nail down trends and patterns, but the patterns I have seen in peat-based engineered medias is when you're reusing soil over and over again, the nutrients that tend to become deficient first would be nitrogen, potassium, and manganese. The plant's uptaking a ton of nitrogen. So just if you think about the volume of soil, it's uptaking a huge amount of nitrogen every round, and you're sort of, it's in the body of the frame of the crop, 5% usually. So that's why nitrogen is often low. Potassium is also taken up in high quantities. It's fairly soluble oftentimes, especially when you're using potassium sulfate or silicate. And same with manganese. Manganese I'm seeing just consistently low on soil tests and the paste and on the standard tests. So those are sort of the top deficiencies to be aware of when you're reusing your soil round after round. Low iron in tissue. So this is a challenging one because iron organically is only plants available in the reduced form, the 2+ form. We have well aerated soils, typically with a higher pH, above 6, above 7, and that leads to the oxidation of iron into the 3+ form, which is not plant available. So I consistently see low iron in tissue, and there's really two suggestions I have there. One is, and actually I would always apply micronutrient sulfates, which is what I recommend. Again, targeted and precision. I'd always apply it with either humic acid or molasses. It's a carbon source. It buffers it for the microbiology, but it also chelates it and holds it in a more plant available form. Brandon's really into this right now. I was talking to him earlier. He's got a line of products that he's excited about. And the idea is you're chelating them to humic acid. The other suggestion, which I'm actually more excited about, is you core iron sulfate in a pocket, mixed 50-50 with elemental sulfur. Ideally 25% granular elemental sulfur, 25% powdered, and 50% iron sulfate, which creates a pocket of low pH. It's a reduced environment so that iron never converts to the 3+ form. That's used, I found that in a bunch of university publications for like landscape trees that get iron chlorosis and they core iron sulfate. I'm going to do it in my orchard this year. I've seen it work very well in cannabis. Feeding manganese, very small quantities of manganese throughout the flower cycle to just keep it available. I think that's really important, especially anecdotally for terpene production. And then the final pattern I see is excesses. And I think this has been talked about a lot. The KISS guys have been talking about this. I see excess in magnesium, sodium, and chloride quite a bit. And what makes the chloride thing seems to keep coming up. I'm going to increase the level at which I suggest leaching soil because I'm consistently seeing really good crops at pretty high chloride levels. That said, chloride is not optimal. It's a plant nutrient, but what the numbers I'm seeing on soil tests are like 200, 300 ppm. That's like suboptimal. It creates osmotic stress on the plant, which is usually a hidden thing. You're usually not necessarily seeing like visual burning, but it's not allowing peak photosynthesis. So those are the three I see. Now, when to leach and how to leach. If people are interested, I can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so I've spoken about 4 of the 5 lessons of what I think makes a profitable farmer. This one was long because it's the testing part. And the 5th one is something that I believe leads to profitability, which is a mindset of regeneration. And I've spent some time thinking about kind of what this new cannabis community can learn from the pioneers of regenerative agriculture. And when I say new, I know this community's been around for a while, but not compared to some of the pioneers in regenerative agriculture. So this guy is kind of a hero of mine. I was about to say mentor, but he's definitely not a mentor. This is Wendell Berry. So it's like, what can we learn from Wendell Berry, the Wes Jacksons, the Gabe Browns, the Alan Savorys, sort of the pioneers in regenerative ag. And also from the older, I've been thinking about like what have I learned from the older generation of farmers that I've been able to interact with in my own experience farming. And my takeaway, and I thought about this a lot for this presentation specifically, is that the key to this whole living systems thing is to focus on relationships. So I know this isn't a science-based concept, but bear with me just for a few minutes because I think it's actually really important, and I'm pretty passionate about it as a grower. And when I say relationships come in many forms, and so let's talk about people relationships first and foremost. When you help another grower in this industry, that's building relationships. When you pay your employees well, when you treat your employees well, those are relationships that can potentially stay with you for your entire life, even after those people stop working for you. This conference, part of the reason I'm so excited to be here is this conference is building relationships. When you put a little bit of time into learning who's selling carbon-based inputs in your local area, whether that's compost or wood chips or mulch, that's building relationships and resilience in your local area. And I think most importantly, when you help another grower, which I think sometimes feels counterintuitive, but when you help another grower in this industry, you change the paradigm from one of competition to one of mutual success. And it's interesting, the farmers, I've interacted with a lot of farmers in my local area who are old guys who have been orcharding for 40 years. And when I ask them questions, they are so eager and excited to help. It's like they're wide open. There's no weirdness around competition, and the reason for that is because they know that we're sort of all in it together, and the industry rises and falls together. And so they sort of operate out of this mindset of abundance, even in their world of scarcity. And I think that's something we should all think about. And relationships kind of go beyond people. They apply in a more broad sense. So when you aim to maximize soil health, you inherently are changing your relationship with biology. When you reuse your soil round after round, you change your relationship with your resource use. We're in a pretty hot, resource-intensive crop. And when you reuse your soil, you're essentially respecting peat bogs and the ecosystems in other people's backyards. And I think that's super important. I'm really passionate about that. And when you start growing food, in addition to cannabis, in my opinion, you're sort of changing your relationship with your craft and with cultivation in general. It's cool. I think every presenter today has mentioned food production in one form or another. And to me, like, some things are a job and some things are a craft. And the primary difference is not the task, but the enthusiasm and the curiosity you bring to that task. And so the more engaged and interested you are, the more it becomes a craft. And what I love about what Steve is doing here is he's building a team at Green Life Productions. He's building a veggie farm. He's putting relationships first, but he's also really investing in his place, like the place he lives, where we are right now, which I think is like part of what regeneration is. I think living soil is more than like a definition. It's more of a philosophy of how we approach farming. And true regeneration requires us to value these relationships too. So I said the mindset of regeneration leads to more profitability. And so let's talk about money for a second. We all want to make more money, and that's not a bad thing. And I think it's logical to think that the fluffy relationship thing is not necessarily going to lead to more profitability, but I totally disagree. And in the last couple of years, I've noticed that for every rich hustler you see on Instagram, there's also an older, wiser, values-based person who's also building wealth in their life. You just don't see them because they're not on Instagram. And this applies to farmers. I've been meeting these farmers and I'm like, wow, these people exist. This is super cool. And I think it's just a good reminder for all of us that the only difference between the rich hustler on Instagram and the values-based farmer is speed. So if you move too quick, if you focus on relationships, I really think you get to the goal eventually. But if you just focus on the short-term gain, you often you may or may not get to the goal, but if you do get there, you sort of do so by bypassing all the more important things in the process and in life. And so that's what this guy would say, I think, is if we focus on relationships, we don't obsess over profit in the short term, and we really focus on the fundamentals that build value to your customers and to the relationships in your life, and you do so with patience, that the wealth you will build will be of a more holistic nature. And so that's my like shtick. I know tomorrow's theme is regeneration, so maybe this is a good transition into tomorrow. I'll just say nearly everything takes longer than you think, so get started and don't worry about the clock. And with that, I urge all of you to continue forward with a mindset of abundance, knowing that a rising tide lifts all ships, and we're all sort of in this together. So, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey guys, so if you want to ask a question, we got Steve's going to be on one side, I'm going to be on the other side. We're going to get you guys the microphone. We want the question to be heard by everybody and be recorded by the system so everybody can get as much knowledge of this as possible. And we still got plenty of time here, so let's have some fun. Okay, I saw his hand first. Bryant will be calling out the next question.
The when and how to leach question. Definitely interested in that.
Okay, so I used to be real quick to say leach the soil, retest and re-amend, because it's when you're just looking at the paper, that's the optimal solution when you're looking at the data. But operationally, it can be a real pain in the ass to leach your soil, especially if you're inside, especially if you don't have a drain. So what I have found in the soils that most of us are working in is it actually takes quite a bit of water to really push the levels down. What I say is leach until you get 6 to 12 inches of leachate. It's just super rough. I mean, you can put an EC meter and leach until it's 50% of where you started. Saponins definitely increase the rate of, they help a lot. People always say yucca extract, but really any saponin product. So when to leach? I mean, I think I'm going to move. The Soil Doctor tool is a tool that sort of allows you to input soil test results and gives you an immediate recommendation. You also have to input a bunch of information about your grow. I'm going to change my algorithm to be either 280 or 300 ppm of chloride. Again, 250 is not optimal, but neither is spending a bunch of time and money leaching. So it's just sort of like a cost-benefit operational trade-off with leaching. Sodium, I suggest leaching above 60 parts per million on the paste test, or I'd say more importantly, when the percentage of sodium goes above your percentage of potassium as a percent of cations in the soil solution, that's where I see weird stuff happen in the plants. Magnesium. Problem with magnesium is I think most of it is complex. Look, when I see really high magnesium, it's usually not because someone dumped a bunch of Epsom salts on. That would be easy. You just leach them out. It's pretty soluble. It's usually because you're using too much of a high magnesium compost. And so the problem with leaching is you can get the magnesium out of the soil solution, but the compost is going to continue mineralizing and releasing magnesium. So, I don't like it over 70 or 80 parts per million on the paste test, but deciding when to leach and when not to leach, I think kind of depends on where that magnesium is coming from.
You mentioned those two Logan tests, primarily your method for engineered media. What would be your go-to for native topsoil?
Same exact two tests, but the interpretation is different. So I have two different agronomic models where I put a lot more weight on the standard test. And to be totally honest, soil testing topsoil is just such a limited picture when it comes to nutrient management. I just think we have to layer in, there's just so much context in farming, to really do it right. So we have to layer in plant tests, whether that's tissue or sap, and just there's so much more to it. So I think the best thing you're seeing when you test topsoil is total exchange capacity, which I don't even look at when I'm looking at engineered media, but cation exchange capacity, which is really correlated with texture. Organic matter in the systems we're running for small organic farmers is not that helpful, but I do think about nitrogen release from organic matter. I look at phosphate, that is actually very helpful. Actually, I look at all of it, and it is very helpful now that I say it. I just think that a lot of soils, they're fairly static. Like the soil I grow in has a pH of 8.2, and it has enormous amounts of calcium, and you can't really move that soil chemistry very easily. So a soil test is limited in its usefulness in certain topsoils. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
So I have a question about the ferments you were testing. Did you do any testing for the stability of the available phosphorus and stuff like that over time? As in, like, could it be like very available at first and drop in availability at later points, or just like an instant snapshot?
The only ferment test I've seen is when the person making the ferment determines it's done or complete.
So like right at completion.
At completion, and then I don't even know how they're defining that. Probably pH, or just the protocol for how many weeks. I think the only thing, obviously those numbers are going to change as it ferments. They're going to release, but Tad and I were talking about the other day is nitrogen is definitely one that moves around. So, for example, if you make a tea, like you're putting those products through the nitrogen cycle, whether it's compost or castings or alfalfa meal when you're making teas. So that number would be interesting to see over time. And it's not stable; it can volatilize. But everything else, once it's in the barrel, it shouldn't leave the barrel. Like it can't really volatilize, so it's just going to change ionic form and whether it's organically complex or soluble.
If we're on the topic of ferments, so you mentioned that was undiluted, and it had a high amount of phosphorus, and people typically, I'm not a big ferment guy either, but I sometimes I do it. I've done kombucha, diluted into soil too, but they dilute it to a point where it's not really the amount of nutrition that's being applied in diluted form doesn't look significant on paper.
Yes, correct. So yeah. Oh, sorry.
Well, I guess where I was going with that is there's also the other end of the spectrum where people have reported feeding high amounts and damaging plants. But also the amount that's applied where they report damage doesn't look high to me either, because compared to things like salt feeds where there's 150 ppms of nitrate or 70 ppms of phosphorus, it's not even approaching that even when it's fully concentrated. So when you do use it, what dilution rate do you recommend? Is it the 1 to 100 that the guys typically use, or is it like, because I'm thinking like, you could probably use like 1 to 20, right? Like I haven't played around with it too much.
Yeah, that's a great question. Based on the tests I've seen, you could increase the dilution rate from the Jadam book quite a bit. I mean, the one we looked at, 1 to 20 would be fine. I haven't gotten many, so, and to be clear, most people, I don't think, are using ferments just for nutrition. They're using it for the microbial byproducts that come in ferments that create beneficial, plant effects and microbial stimulation in the soil. So I sort of take a unique take. I'm a nutrient guy. I specialize in nutrition, so I like to test everything, and I look at the ppms. But I don't think that's why most people are doing it. But to your point, you could totally use it at 1 to 20. And I haven't heard of, I guess I don't coach people to do that, but I haven't heard of negative effects, but it sounds like you've heard of some bad reports.
What looks like burning. The other thing is there's a theory that in the poor soils that they typically apply those products to, it would free up things that are really like, it's like copper in a lot of those soils is like less than 1 ppm. And like there's a theory that makes that more available, and that's one of the big benefits of applying
Right.
a product like that. Have you seen that in tissue or sap or anything?
No, I haven't. I haven't seen it that it's like that effective. It's not like a synthetic chelate or something. If you
Right.
look. The other thing is all the ferments are different. So like garbage in, garbage out. You could put you could put a plant in there that creates high sodium, like chlorine, whatever. So all that burning could be from a weird ferment or something. I don't know. Maybe they pack the barrel more full and it's a different plant species. Who knows? Again, I don't even want to talk anymore about ferments because I really don't know. It's not really my thing.
I know, Eric, you have one too, right?
I have a question. Maybe Steve even has a little bit of an answer to it because it could be a little bit of experience and what you might think. What do you think is the optimal in like these raised living soil beds, the optimal moisture content, like minimum and maximum? Because it's not all about always trying to keep things, we're not pulse irrigating in a sense and giving a lot of shots with even like the blue mats and things. And so what would you say is the minimum and maximum in your opinion?
So so I can give you numbers that I just throw out to growers when I get the question of what should be the optimal moisture level on a tensiometer. I get that question all the time. And Izzy threw out some numbers earlier. What I say is start at 80 millibars and if you want to dry back, you dry back 40%. And I've sort of, those numbers are just baselines, like just very rough guidelines. Now, if you're talking volumetric soil water content, I don't have numbers because it totally depends on the media. Is that what you were asking? I guess I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, the tensiometer is the best bet. But like I said, I really think you want to get to know your media and the optimal moisture by feel for veg specifically, and then you want to see what that correlates to on your sensors, and then that's your target. But in terms of between like veg and flower, I don't know. I'd say I would say don't dry back too much. Like part of me thinks that recommending dry backs is a dangerous game because you can overstress, you can reduce yield.
So we've been talking about excess available nutrients and shortages on these available nutrients and testing that we can do. And I've heard you mention compost is an input, but I've never heard you mention anything about lab testing for number of protozoa, nematodes, presence of the entire soil food web, and how that's going to correlate with these missing nutrients. When I walk up to, say, a virgin farm, and I just grab a test of the soil and I see, I'm short on phosphorus, I just start dumping phosphorus in. Does that make sense when I really should be looking at the numbers of the soil food web and then determine if I'm going to be short?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's a good contribution to the holistic picture of kind of how you think about soil. What I would say is in a peat-based engineered media, it's not a topsoil, so there's not like an infinite reservoir of nutrients. And in fact, if you took peat is inert. Like there's like,
I'm looking more at agriculture.
Okay, topsoil.
Sorry.
Yeah. So if we look at topsoil, here's my belief. I think we should be doing all the things we can in our context to promote microbial diversity, microbial abundance, and just general populations. And I'm kind of old school. I subscribe to like NRCS principles of like, you want a constant carbon flow through your soil. You want to keep your soil covered. You want to minimize disturbance. You want to maximize biodiversity. And if you can, incorporate animals. And that is going to lead to the greatest microbial abundance and diversity in your soil. That's going to maximize nutrient cycling. But to answer your question, to me, the soil food web approach has fallen short in the sense that, well, I've worked in that blueberry farm, actually, in Willamette Valley, and multiple other farms there, sort of went down that path. a decade ago, and didn't have good results. I did some analysis where I would send the soil to get a genome test, where it literally gives you all the microorganisms in the entire soil, and then also use microscopy. I sent like to Rutherford or someone who looks at microscopy, and then I would also do all my nutrient tests, and I would try to correlate all that, and I continued to struggle with the consistency of the microbial tests. I also used the microbiometer, which is like a sort of more DIY microbial test. So I think to answer your question, I just haven't seen effective testing for that. Like, we all know it's critically important for nutrient cycling. I think it's very, very important. But I don't necessarily think that microbes are always the way to get more nutrients. I think that we should do everything in our power to promote general abundance and diversity. But I think trying to control individual species or families is an approach that I don't subscribe to. And I know that that's not everyone in this room, and I think that's okay. And I think that, in my experience, it's fallen short a little bit. I'd also say that, like, if we try to get out of the schools of thought, it can all work together. And also, I would say that, like, yeah, I mean, I recommend microbial consortiums all the time. I feed microbes. I'm super into general microorganisms. But I think, like, if I want to get more phosphorus to the plant, I don't know. It's not the approach I take. Yeah, I don't subscribe to that. But I do think the approach that we're using with nutrition that I subscribe to. The reason I'm stick to organic products is the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and most of the potassium is all carbon-based. And when you apply carbon-based inputs with nutrients to your soil, you create a flush of microbial activity that has a multiplier effect. So that's why you can apply 150 pounds per acre in granular poultry manure of nitrogen in granular poultry manure, and you see more nitrogen than 150 pounds because the microbial mineralization is higher than that. It takes organic matter and other organic residues, and it gives you 250 pounds. So I think using organic products and cycling carbon through that system is the best we can do.
So when we're talking about living soil, we're talking about engineered media. We're talking about usually running in beds of some sort. So when we're talking about nutrient cycling, the eventual buildup and requirement of leachate at some point in time can be running where they're actually cycling through a long enough period of time in these beds. What do you believe is the optimal soil volume or depth where you're getting the sweet spot of the ability to nutrient cycle with top dressed amendments throughout the entire stratosphere, but also being able to monitor and manage your moisture content, your nutrient cycling, and your eventual buildup of leachate, but not requiring so much flooding through of a large volume of soil, which you need to have more moisture. But is it better to maybe go deeper and need to do leachate less often, or go shallower and do it more often?
That's a good question. And I'm assuming you're talking about indoor, and I'm assuming, a lot of this depends on like how big if you're limited on canopy size. But you're asking about depth or soil volume, or both?
But I mean, let's just standardize 4x8.
So standardized to like a 4x8, because that's, I think, a size that everybody can at some point relate to. Even if you're running, 24 or 100 foot long lengths, you can break it down into 4x8 sizes.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have a good answer to that, but my initial gut says like 18 inches. That's probably what I'd start with. In terms of soil volume per plant, it kind of depends on how you want your canopy to look. Because to me, the more volume you give, the bigger the plants get, just as a rule of thumb. So you want to think about how you want your canopy architecture to look. The more soil volume, the better from a nutrient reservoir standpoint. So you're just going to be able to feed less often. But some people are like, we're going 7 gallons and we're going organic living soil. That to me would make me nervous. I think that's small. I think you'd be feeding like crazy. Also, just like water, you've got to be really dialed with your watering. So there's just less margin for error. I think you're just. I always grew when I was. I guess this was years ago. The trend I've seen is, and this was pointed out earlier, the pot size started big and got smaller, and so it was like 100 gallon and then 30 gallon and then 20, and it just seems like it's getting smaller. So I always, when I used to grow in pots, it was always 30 gallons. But beds to me are way preferable from a moisture management standpoint, and it just seems like that anecdotally that's where people are getting the best success, and I would do 18 inches personally.
Yeah, bigger beds and bigger pots, guys. The manufacturers can tell you that.
So then I guess to harp on that a little bit further, if we're going to say that we want to run essentially an 18-inch, just for argument's sake, an 18-inch over-horizon, do you have any thoughts on alluvial layers within, like let's say we have a 2-foot deep grassroots concrete bed. What do we do with that extra space that we have? Do we just leave that as empty space within the bed? Do we build a sub-matrix of gravel, stone, sand, silt, clay, or do we just run bluestone or just leave it alone?
Yeah, that's a great. There's definitely two schools of thought on this. Originally, I was way more like, no, you want consistent homogeneous soil with. You don't want the perched water table, and I'd say now I'm more agnostic because there was a workshop that I missed with sort of the more layering technique, and I just don't know enough about that, nor do I have enough experience to have a strong opinion either way. My style has always been you go homogeneous and you just do one, but there's so many ways to grow, and I think that I don't have a strong opinion.
Could you explain estimated nitrogen release on the local standard and how you would practically interpret that for living soil substrates and for mineral native soils?
So I would suggest, by the way, when growers test through me, I don't do the 5 add-ons. And I believe the estimated nitrogen release is part of the 5 add-ons. What they're doing is they're taking a calculation, an agronomic calculation that I also use when I'm looking at topsoil. And I can't recite it, it's in a spreadsheet. But essentially, for every % organic matter, you're estimating how much nitrogen it's going to release, and it's just an equation. There's an equation for every %. And I don't have it memorized. I would completely not use that for peat-based media because the organic matter that they're testing it's measured with loss on ignition. So you essentially just heat the substrate up to 2,000 degrees and see how much CO2 is lost. Well, that's all peat moss and compost. That's not true organic matter. So the calculations that were established for topsoil are totally different. They're looking at like true organic matter in soil, which is much more complex recalcitrant compounds that have been forming for sometimes like hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it's just don't use it for peat-based media.
We still got about 20, 30 minutes, guys, so drum up those questions, keep them coming here.
And by the way, we don't have to go that long. I intentionally kept it short just because it's the end of the night.
I got a couple.
But I'll also be here as long as people want me to be here.
I've had a hard time moving manganese and manganese sulfate, both in living soil substrates and mineral soils. What kind of applications would you do if we use a context of maybe a 3rd gallon pot? If you've got anything in mind.
So I think of everything in 2 metrics that are probably unhelpful: pounds per acre and pounds per cubic yard of soil volume. And so for manganese sulfate, I'm generally recommending just 1 to 3 teaspoons per cubic yard of soil volume. Again, probably better if I did it in grams. And probably better if I did it in gallons, but anyway, you'll have to convert it from there. The standard test, you probably won't see it move it at all. Yeah, and that's why I like to manage manganese on the paste test. I like to just keep a real low level of solubility in the solution.
So as long as it's flowing, it will take that.
Yeah, I don't even look at the number on the standard. Topsoil, honestly, topsoil is the same. Because in topsoil, manganese has a similar fate as iron in terms of its redox reactions, and so often the number on the standard test on a Malic 3 is worthless.
It's pretty much what I found.
Yeah. And when I have my buddy run the regression analysis between standard test and paste test, the scatter plot is like a senseless cloud, which means there's no correlation to standard and paste.
Have you played around with the reduction of manganese in any kind of preparation?
So I haven't, but I would also recommend if you had persistently low manganese to mix it into the iron sulfate core with elemental sulfur. It'll also keep it reduced. The difference though is that I don't see low manganese as like when there's low manganese on a tissue test and a grower applies manganese, it works. Iron doesn't always work. So I don't think it's as important to keep it in that reduced form. I always say chelate it with a humic substance if you can.
If it goes into the tissue, are you assuming that it's physiologically active, or could it just be present and not being used?
I'm assuming it's physiologically active, or at least the plant has an intelligence enough to utilize it. I can't think of a situation. I mean, and actually, yeah, physiology. Scott made a good answer to this. I think that when a nutrient has excesses, it'll first start to put it into the vacuole and store it and try to like just put it aside. But there are very few instances that I can think of where it's like physiologically somehow locked up.
I've heard people talking sap about oxidized iron in the sap. Where it's not actually usable, but it's present.
Well, so I would say that the plant has the ability to reduce and oxidize once it's in its frame. It takes energy to do that, but it can do magical things. I mean,
most times it produces it.
It's like a factory. It's complicated, but it can do things like that. It also, it has carbon too, so it uses carbon to do all these different functions.
What's your take on using foliars indoors?
Well, okay. One, you got to be indoors. You're always considering your environment, and outdoors too. But so I guess okay. So foliars are funny. I go back and forth on foliars. I think foliars are effective in kind of maintaining and just continuing to push photosynthesis. I don't think they're effective as the primary source of nutrition. I'm a soil guy. I think the majority of nutrient uptake happens in the roots. I've grown amazing crops. I've grown amazing cannabis outside with no foliars, zero. And so part of my bias is like, you don't need them. That said, they're extremely popular and some growers swear by them, and anecdotally they totally work. And actually scientifically too, they work very, very well. So I would say I don't know, but inside, I wouldn't do it past, well, it depends on the product. Don't do it too late into flower. But I'd say focus on the soil first. Foliars sometimes can be effective if you're really struggling with a micronutrient. Just because the quantities needed. Okay, so molybdenum is a great example. So if I took a SAP test and I saw that molybdenum was low and nitrate was high, I might do a very, very dilute foliar of something like sodium molybdate, or I might try to find a more organic chelated form. I used to use this what was it called? It's called like blue gold moly, which I hate to even be naming like a bottled nutrient, but it's like a, if I want specifically molybdenum in a carbon-based form, like I would essentially foliar apply that. But the macronutrients are less compelling to me. I think the majority of macronutrient uptake is happening in the roots. And in fact, this year in my orchard, I'm splitting my orchard in half and I'm doing a split test, like I explained in the presentation. And half of my orchard is going to get probably 12 calcium foliars. And I'm doing every single organic calcium foliar I can think of, including the Jadam calcium, I'm doing albion metallocate calcium, I'm doing all kinds of calcium foliars, polyamines, And the other half of the orchard is getting no foliar, no calcium foliars at all. And I'm curious if I'm going to see anything, both on the tissue data, the sap data, and just visually in the plant response, as well as my fruit set, my yield, my fruit firmness. I'm going to try to observe as many things as I can to see if there's any difference whatsoever. I would think about cannabis in a similar way, just in terms of trying to reduce inputs, reduce labor time, etc. That said, I mean, the cannabis community, I think, has sort of come to just the reality that foliars really can kind of keep that plant cranking along. And it's not just nutritional, right? There's foliars, aloe, and all kinds of stuff that you can use that sort of help prime the pump. But from a purely nutritional standpoint, kind of, I don't know, they're not my favorite.
What about the idea that the plant's feeding the soil, so if you give a balanced foliar, that you're influencing the exudates that are coming out into the soil?
Yeah, that's a very AEA philosophy. John Kempf, really smart dude. It's kind of his narrative, and it's definitely true that plants, 10 to 40% of their photosynthetes go out into the roots to feed soil microbiology, and that's what creates, more nutrient cycling, more growth. That's a very positive thing. But I haven't seen any evidence that a foliar would increase that. I think that a healthy plant would increase exudation, but not necessarily foliars.
What about just either applying a general balanced foliar, say for micronutrients, against a more targeted one, I suppose based on testing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my approach is you test, don't guess. Choose the individual micronutrient and apply that. But there's limitations, right? So if you don't want to have 50-pound bags of every single micronutrient or whatever, then it depends on your size and your scale and everything. A balanced foliar is fine.
Would you say that is there a danger of making an imbalance in the soil worse by doing a sort of general foliar?
No. Yeah. And actually, okay, so that's another reason I like foliars. That's a good point. For whatever reason, when I see, and I still haven't figured this out, sometimes when I see excess magnesium in the soil, the plants will sometimes display magnesium deficiency, which usually shows up as interveinal chlorosis. An Epsom salt foliar is very effective. And so that's a great time to use a foliar because you're not adding more to the soil, but you're giving the plant what it needs. So I like Epsom salt actually. That's actually probably one of my favorite foliars.
What about fulvic and humic acids?
I think so. Every single foliar I apply, I use fulvic acid. It's been proven to be a penetrant, so it helps penetrate the cuticle. I mean, the nutrients can go through the stomata. They can also go direct, and so fulvic acid every time. Also, just when you can get carbon into the plant with nutrients, that's a metabolic win. So, Matt, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, the magnesium thing. So, did you see that in play or media or?
Media.
Oh, the magnesium problem is most likely, it's less likely in media, but it's more likely in clay. What's happening is if there's an excess of magnesium, it's closing the colloid down and preventing root uptake. So people are I think the Dutch had this happen. If I remember it, I can't remember what farm it was, but they had a magnesium problem. They were applying more magnesium, exacerbating the problem until some agronomist came by and was like, pull the soil sample. Saw a ton of magnesium in the soil. They threw gypsum down, which is calcium, but it pushed the magnesium off, opened the soil up. So even though total numbers wise there was less magnesium in the soil, it was available. So they just had to, I can't say that that's what's happening in media because it's arguably loose anyway.
Right.
But that's maybe what was happening.
Totally. So in topsoil, I've worked with probably 4 growers. There's a little pocket in the think the Siskiyou Mountains in southern Oregon. There's different pockets around the country of what's called serpentine soil, which has super high magnesium. And it's a nightmare because it collapses the clay colloid, it makes a really tight soil, and the solution that I recommend, this isn't my solution, this is like the agronomic solution, is like 6 to 8 tons per acre of gypsum in the fall. And it does exactly what you're saying, is it pushes calcium, has a 2+ charge. It should push, on aggregate, it should push the magnesium off the colloid. And then, with anything like that, you need enough water that runs through the soil profile to leach out the excess, because otherwise there's just a ton. So, same with sodium. If you have acidic soil, like large gypsum applications and then water running through the profile is the best solution. In media, though, I don't subscribe to the idea that magnesium tightens soil.
Even if it's like 30% compost?
I haven't seen that. But again, people disagree with me on that, and that's fine. That's totally fine.
To touch back on foliars, do you have an opinion on extremely micronized carbon being applied as a foliar and being able to be uptaken directly through the cells and through the stomata, basically, and how that can offset CO2 consumption when we're using supplemental CO2 within a facility, how we can offset CO2 supplementation by providing micronized carbon directly to the plant through the cells?
So the first thing you said is totally scientifically proven and very effective in terms of carbon acting as a penetrant, like I said. Also, specifically with nitrogen, conventional growers of large commodity grains, especially in Canada, they foliar apply urea. And urea is far better as a foliar. It's more efficient, it's more effective because it's actually a carbon-based nitrogen. But now they're applying all kinds of, they're putting seaweed and they're combining their urea with all kinds of humic acids and fulvic acids because it's metabolically just so much preferable. It kind of primes the plant, the plant sees the carbon. I forgot how this was explained. For whatever reason, the plant responds better. To your question about whether you can offset CO2, I don't think so. I don't think you'd be applying enough carbon. Yeah, if you think about how much CO2 is in the air versus how much you'd be getting into the leaf, it's orders of magnitude different. Yeah.
I was wondering a little bit about calcium lignosulfonate and its ability to help with osmotic stress, but also, induce certain plant responses, morphological change, and so forth.
So I'm not familiar with that product. Yeah, sorry. I don't think that'd be allowed in organic production, and that's why I'm not familiar with it. What is it? Okay. Lignosulfate. Oh. Huh. Yeah, I can't speak to that.
Any other questions, guys? Oh, up there, Steve, want to hit that?
Just to sort of back to that first question about flushing. Is there an equation based on soil volume? I know you mentioned, testing your runoff. But is there a kind of a general way to go to the start?
No, not that I know of. I don't have one, and I haven't seen one. A better rule of thumb on how to flush would be, I think, really helpful for the industry. And I haven't created that. Tad, I feel like someone on your team had a little more information on that. But no, I haven't seen an equation.
Just expanding on the calcium thing, you said you're doing a calcium trial with lots of inputs. Overcrop saying that they've seen milk shift calcium, which is kind of strange. I wanted to ask, have you used calcium, or are you using calcium lactate or calcium glucoheptanate, which is sometimes called gluconate?
Never heard of either of those. But I'd be interested to hear more, because literally I'm all ears when it comes to what would be the most effective calcium foliars allowed in organic production. Because I'll test those.
The agronomist from Hortinova, the agronomic arm of Nova Crop, said that they'd even put milk into hydro, and it works. Well, so it'd be interesting. So we don't spray it on wheat plants. Probably not very good.
What's the interaction you see between VPD and nutrient uptake?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is around VPD and nutrient uptake. Massive effect. VPD has an unbelievable effect on nutrient uptake because it's dictating the transpiration rate of plants. I mean, that and soil moisture are the primary determinants. So, calcium and boron are the first two that come to mind because they are entirely transported up through the xylem in the transpiration stream. But all nutrients are as well. So, yeah, VPD is a funny one. Now that said, I always assumed, because I often see low calcium in the plant, high calcium in the soil. I assume, okay, either the soil moisture is off or the VPD is off. But my learning from apple production in the last year, and my own peach orchard for that matter, is vigor and the nitrogen status of the plant also play a major role. So growing shoots, any like apical growth on a plant requires a huge amount of calcium. So if you have tons of shoot growth, so you just top the plant, whatever, you have a ton of shoot growth and the plant has a lot of vigor, it really struggles to keep up with calcium. And that's what leads to bitter pit in apples. And, one of the many things, but the leading models from universities on bitter pit show that vigor and nitrogen status of the apple matter a lot. So VPD may be less important than I thought. There's just so many variables to nutrient uptake. But yeah, VPD is huge. Super, super huge. That said, I liked Eric's point, because I've always grown outside. And, super dry. I mean, it's just like here. It's bone dry and hot. So your VPD is in the red zone all the time. And you can grow great plants. Like you can grow great quality and get good yield. And so VPD, plants are more resilient than you think when it comes to VPD. The problem with controlled environment is you're pushing light intensity, sometimes CO2, sometimes nutrients harder. So there's a little bit more of a balance that you have to reach, and so VPD I think actually matters more in a lot of instances when you have all the variables you have to control. And yeah.
I heard you say something about manganese leading to higher terpene content. Did I hear that?
Very anecdotal, but yes.
Yes. Okay. So, and another question is, what was the ppms of like the rest of the nutrients? You gave a ppm of 125 to 150. Roughly on the nitrogen. What was the pK, calcium?
So yeah. So I look at the cations on the paste test primarily. The standard way to look at calcium seems to be, well, the old way, the way I learned is from this Albrecht approach, which is you look at the base cation saturation, and so a lot of people in cannabis like to see 75 to 85% base saturation of calcium. I don't like that. I like to look at the paste test, and I like to see 150 to 200 ppm of calcium. I like to see, I wish I had my model in front of me. Something like 40 to 45 ppm of magnesium, and potassium's a funny one because my target originally was 125. I've gotten feedback from growers that they like to go higher to 175, but honestly, the tissue data and the yield looks pretty good lower. So I think again, you gotta match the two. But so anyway, the point is, I'd say maybe 100, 75 to 100, up to 150.
And if you have some of that like salts in there or whatever, sodium and stuff, would you use more like potassium to try to fight that?
Yeah, so I have a
flush, let's say.
Yeah, I have a balancing, like this mathematical thing that if any one cation is excessive, it moves the levels of the other cations up to try to create better balance. But you'll never create perfect balance if something's excessive. It's just a very slight modification. You don't want to push everything too high, trying to create balance, because it's just too much.
So on the flushing then, when you flush all that out, you flush all of your bacteria and everything you're flushing out, including maybe probably some of these nutrients that, and maybe you don't have a soil test to go off of. You get your soil test and you see it, you see all this sodium.
You lose your mind because you see all the sodium and the chloride, and like, shit, what do? You flush it, right? And so then, without information, new tests, you're just trying to instant fix. What's the recommendation there?
Yeah.
Other than the test.
Okay, well, the first thing is, I don't necessarily think you flush out all of the bacteria. I think the bacteria and the fungi are, if you zoomed in on soil, their habitat is like these micro pockets on organic material, on clays, and so yeah, some of them will get flushed out for sure, but a lot of them are protected in soil pores and different aggregates, and I know those are topsoil terms, but the same kind of habitat exists in peat-based media.
Would you want to maybe like put a T in at the end of your flush? Maybe not even for bacteria stuff, with like some soluble nutrients in it.
Well, yeah, let me touch on the nutrient point. So when you flush, you're flushing all the soluble nutrients out of the soil solution, and you're not flushing anything that's adsorbed or complex in organic material. That said, you're not flushing all your nutrients out, because if you take if you're testing the leachate, right, it might go from 3 to 2, or whatever. There's still nutrients in there. But yes, you have. You're flushing all the excess. You're flushing all the soluble nutrients out. I just say you got to retest. But if you're in a pinch, throw in 3 cups per cubic yard of gypsum. Throw in, do a tea maybe with some soluble amino acids in it, and.
It's just a problem I ran into with the sodium and chloride and freaked out. I flushed it and I noticed.
I noticed differences, and then I started amending with those things that I noticed were lacking via test.
I'd say top dress some nitrogen and like some alfalfa meal, or
There was potassium in particular that.
Potassium soluble. Yeah.
So that was a big one for me. And
the thing about potassium is, I recommend a lot of potassium sulfate, and that's soluble. So yeah, you could always throw it, but a lot of the potassium in the soils we're working in is actually mineralizing from compost. So yeah, it depends on your soil composition, but sometimes you just keep getting, the preferred source of potassium, in my opinion, is compost mineralization, as long as you have a good compost. But that'll just keep releasing potassium to your plants. But I think in general, the reason I recommend a lot of potassium sulfate is because a grower doesn't have good compost, doesn't want to use compost for pest and disease issues, or there's just not enough. And so it's like potassium sulfate is a great product to they get the ppms from 50 to 80 or whatever you want to do in flour.
All right, guys, is that it for it here? Can we give Bryant a big round of applause? That was amazing, guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for your questions too. That was the most interactive thing I've ever seen.